In the midst of the terror of the Third Reich, there existed a place of which little is spoken, but whose name echoes as a cry of horror: Ravensbrück, the largest concentration camp exclusively for women. There, more than 130,000 prisoners of different nationalities were imprisoned: Jewish women, Roma women, political prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses, and even women accused of being undesirable by the regime. They not only faced hunger, forced labor, and extreme violence, but also inhuman medical experiments and a brutality designed to break them in body and spirit. Ravensbrück was, in many ways, a forgotten hell of the Nazi machinery. In this video, you will learn the complete history of Ravensbrück, the most atrocious women's camp of the regime, and you will discover why its memory remains one of the darkest and least told pages of the Second World War. The complete history of Ravensbrück, the most atrocious women's camp of the Nazi regime. Ravensbrück was one of the most singular and at the same time most cruel concentration camps of the Third Reich, because it was conceived specifically for women. Its origin dates back to 1938, at a moment when the Nazi regime had already consolidated a large part of its repressive apparatus. Until then, female prisoners were sent to camps such as Lichtenberg, an old castle in Saxony that had been adapted as a concentration camp. However, Lichtenberg proved inadequate. The space was limited, the facilities improvised, and it was not designed to house the growing number of prisoners that Nazi policies were generating. The decision to build Ravensbrück responded to a cold and calculated logic of the regime. They needed a place that centralized and organized the internment of women considered enemies or undesirable. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, ordered that the camp be established near the small locality of Ravensbrück, about 90 kilometers north of Berlin, in an isolated and wooded area that guaranteed isolation, discretion, and ease of surveillance. Construction began in 1938 and was carried out with labor from prisoners transferred from Sachsenhausen, another nearby camp. In May of 1939, the camp received its first 867 prisoners transferred from Lichtenberg. The initial idea was not only to intern them, but also to subject them to a system of discipline and exploitation perfectly aligned with Nazi ideology. Ravensbrück was conceived as a space of punishment, re-education, and gradual elimination, but also as a cog within the economy of the Reich. From its beginnings, it was planned that the female prisoners would work in inhuman conditions for companies linked to the SS and for the German war industry. The profile of the first inmates is revealing of the political and social function of the camp. There were sent communists, social democrats, trade unionists, Jehovah's Witnesses, and women who had resisted the regime in one way or another. But there also arrived women considered asocial: prostitutes, beggars, Roma women, and even women accused of maintaining relationships with Jews or foreigners. The Nazi system not only persecuted political opponents, but also those who did not fit the model of the obedient, submissive, Aryan woman, destined to be the mother of the race. Ravensbrück, in this sense, was also an instrument to discipline female behavior according to the patterns of National Socialism. Over time, the camp grew and expanded. What began as a relatively small enclosure was transformed into a gigantic complex with subcamps distributed throughout Germany and the occupied territories. But in its origin, the construction of Ravensbrück reflected one more step in the institutionalization of Nazi violence. It was no longer enough to have common prisons or to improvise detention spaces. It was about creating a specialized concentration system, where each category of prisoners would have its place and function. And in that scheme, women found in Ravensbrück the cruelest fate. In addition, from the first months, the camp not only served as a prison, it was also conceived as a social and medical laboratory. The SS experimented there with new forms of labor organization, internal control, and exploitation of female labor. Later would come the medical experiments, the forced sterilizations, and the surgical trials. But the root of all this already lay in the vision with which the camp was created. A space where the lives of thousands of women could be used, molded, and destroyed without limits or responsibility. Ravensbrück, in its beginnings, symbolizes the transition of Nazism from political repression to a systematic and planned extermination system. The creation of a camp specifically for women reveals not only the breadth of the Nazi project of social control, but also the depth of its violence, which did not distinguish between battlefronts and civilian life, but extended into the most intimate aspects of society. The transfer of the first prisoners to Ravensbrück marks a decisive moment in the consolidation of the Nazi concentration system specifically designed for women. At the beginning of 1939, when the construction of the camp was still in process, it was decided that the new facility should replace the old Lichtenberg camp, an old castle in Saxony that had functioned as a female concentration camp since 1937. Lichtenberg was insufficient. The facilities were narrow, poorly adapted, and could not accommodate the growing number of women that the regime considered enemies of the state or asocial. The expansion of the Nazi repressive apparatus required a larger and better organized place. In May of 1939, the transfer of the first prisoners from Lichtenberg to Ravensbrück began. This initial group was composed of 867 women selected among communists, social democrats, trade unionists and Jehovah's Witnesses, as well as women labeled as asocial, Roma women, prostitutes, beggars and those who defied the norms of conduct dictated by the regime. The diversity of profiles of these first inmates reflects the breadth of the Nazi repression project. It was not only about punishing political opposition, but also about controlling the social, moral, and cultural life of the female population. The transfer was carried out under the strict supervision of the SS, who organized the transport in specially arranged train convoys. The operation was not casual. It involved a detailed logistical process that included the documentation of each prisoner, the assignment of identification numbers, and the instruction to the guards on the procedures to be followed during the transfer. Each woman was registered, stripped of her personal belongings and tagged with a striped uniform that identified her category within the camp. These categories were not only administrative but also defined the type of work, the movement restrictions, and the surveillance to which they would be subjected. Upon arriving at Ravensbrück, the prisoners were received in facilities still under construction, with incomplete barracks and minimal hygiene conditions. The first days were marked by forced adaptation to a strict routine and the organization of a work system that would become the basis of the camp's operation. Unlike Lichtenberg, which was limited and centralized, Ravensbrück was conceived from the beginning as a complex that could expand indefinitely, with the capacity to house thousands of women and associated subcamps. This allowed the camp, from its inauguration, to operate not only as a prison but also as a tool for the political, social and economic control of women. The arrival of these first prisoners also established a precedent for daily life in Ravensbrück. From the beginning, the inmates were subjected to a regime of rigid discipline, constant surveillance and exhausting labor while being observed by the SS to measure their obedience and capacity for adaptation. The interaction between prisoners and guards was defined from the first moment by strict hierarchy and symbolic and physical violence, creating an environment in which any attempt at resistance or disobedience was quickly repressed. This first transfer, therefore, not only implied a physical change of place, but also symbolized the transition from an improvised internment model to a structured and specialized concentration system. Through Ravensbrück, the Nazi regime demonstrated its capacity to institutionalize violence, plan the exploitation of female labor, and extend its ideological control, laying the foundations for the horrors that would unfold in the following years. The profile of the Ravensbrück inmates reveals much about the political, social, and racial objectives of the Nazi regime. From its first months of operation, the camp received women whom the Third Reich considered dangerous, undesirable, or problematic for society according to its ideology. Among the first prisoners were political activist women, communists, social democrats, trade unionists, and members of resistance movements. They were seen as enemies of the state, representatives of ideologies that threatened the stability and objectives of the regime. The imprisonment of these women had a double purpose: to punish their political activity and, at the same time, to serve as a warning to the civilian population about the consequences of opposition. In addition to political opponents, Ravensbrück housed women considered asocial according to Nazi standards. This term included prostitutes, beggars, Roma women, homeless women, or those who led a lifestyle considered immoral, as well as those accused of maintaining relationships with Jews or foreigners. For the Nazis, these women represented a threat to racial purity and to the traditional values of the German family. Imprisonment in Ravensbrück, therefore, had a disciplinary character. It sought to re-educate them, or in many cases, to eliminate them from the social fabric. The camp also housed women of different nationalities, especially those from countries occupied by Germany. Polish, Russian, Czech, and French women, among others, were sent to Ravensbrück, reflecting the European dimension of the Nazi project of domination and control. Many of them were captured as retaliation for the local resistance, others for fulfilling racial deportation quotas or through the implementation of forced labor policies. The presence of foreign prisoners also served as an instrument of propaganda to demonstrate the forced obedience of conquered peoples and their submission to the Reich. Among the most vulnerable categories of detainees were Jewish women, who soon became one of the most persecuted groups within the camp. Their internment was linked to the systematic policy of extermination that characterized the Holocaust. Roma women and women from ethnic minorities were also detained, reinforcing the racial vision of the regime, which regarded certain lives as inferior and expendable. The age and living conditions of the prisoners also varied. From adolescents to elderly women, all shared a fate marked by forced labor, violence, and the absence of rights. Some were transferred to serve in industrial workshops or for agricultural labor, others for medical experiments that sought scientific advances without any ethical consideration. In this sense, the profile of the detainees not only reflects who were considered enemies or inferiors, but also how the regime used their bodies and their lives as instruments of its political and social project. The group of these women, of different ages, origins, and conditions, constituted a heterogeneous population united only by their submission to Nazi power. Their imprisonment in Ravensbrück reveals the breadth of control that the Third Reich sought to exercise over female society and the depth of institutionalized violence. More than a simple detention camp, Ravensbrück was a space where politics, race, and social discipline intertwined to shape, punish, and in many cases, destroy lives under the relentless logic of Nazism. As the Second World War advanced, Ravensbrück ceased to be a relatively small and isolated camp to become an extensive and multifunctional complex, designed to house thousands of prisoners and to establish itself as a key part of the Nazi concentration system. The expansion of the camp was not improvised. It followed a meticulous plan by the SS that combined logistical, military, and economic needs, as well as the intention to perfect the mechanisms of control and repression over the female population considered enemy or undesirable. The original camp was built near the town of Fürstenberg in a wooded area that provided isolation and security. However, the land soon proved insufficient in the face of the constant increase in prisoners. Between 1941 and 1945, successive expansions were carried out. Additional barracks, industrial workshops, and peripheral subcamps were built, each specialized in different types of labor or intended to house specific groups of women according to their origin or the nature of their crime before the regime. One of the key elements of this expansion was the creation of industrial subcamps known as Außenlager, which functioned as extensions of the main camp. These facilities were directly linked to German companies that collaborated with the SS, such as the Siemens factory or workshops related to the production of armaments and uniforms. The prisoners were transported daily to these subcamps under strict surveillance, and their forced labor became a fundamental part of the German war effort. Economic exploitation was intertwined with political and racial repression. While the Reich obtained profits from cheap labor, the women were subjected to inhuman living conditions, with exhausting workdays, minimal rations, and constant punishment. The expansion also included the construction of medical and experimental facilities. From 1942 onward, Ravensbrück became a center where medical experiments with ideological and military purposes were carried out, many of which were extremely cruel. Experiments of sterilization, drug testing, and surgeries without anesthesia were performed, mainly on Roma women, Jewish women, and political prisoners. These activities required additional infrastructure: laboratories, improvised operating rooms, and special accommodations for the medical teams and the victims, which were part of the constant growth of the complex. In addition, the expansion of the camp followed criteria of segregation. The barracks were divided according to prisoner categories: political, Jewish, Roma, social or religious. Each group had specific areas assigned, separated by fences and guard patrols. This organization allowed the SS to maintain stricter control, prevent communication between different groups, and facilitate the implementation of collective punishments. With the increase in the number of prisoners, the network of surveillance and repression within the camp also grew. Additional watchtowers were installed, the barbed wire fences were reinforced, and patrols multiplied. The female guards, known as Aufseherinnen, played a central role in the expansion of Ravensbrück. Trained and indoctrinated by the SS, they were responsible for the direct control of the prisoners, daily discipline and supervision in workshops, subcamps, and medical experiments. By the end of the war, Ravensbrück was no longer just a concentration camp for women. It was a true industrial and repressive complex with dozens of subcamps throughout Germany and the occupied territories. Its expansion reflected not only the magnitude of the Nazi project of persecution and extermination, but also the efficiency with which the SS combined political, racial, and economic objectives. Each barrack, each wire fence, and each subcamp was part of a system meticulously designed to maximize suffering, exploitation, and absolute control over the prisoners, turning Ravensbrück into a symbol of the organized brutality of the Nazi regime. Forced labor and exploitation in Ravensbrück constituted one of the fundamental pillars of the camp's daily existence and reflected the way in which the Third Reich used prisoners as cogs in its economic and war machinery. From its early years, the women interned were subjected to long, physically exhausting workdays, carried out under conditions that sought to break their bodies and their will. The idea was not only to obtain labor, but also to impose absolute discipline through suffering and inhuman routine. The prisoners worked in internal workshops, factories attached to the camp, and in many cases, in private companies collaborating with the Nazi regime. One of the most frequent tasks consisted of making uniforms, field clothing, and military equipment. Rows of women sewed without rest, with poor lighting, rudimentary furniture, and blunt needles that caused constant injuries. Hygienic conditions were minimal. Contact with chemical materials, dyes, and leather products caused skin diseases, infections, and respiratory ailments. In addition to textile work, Ravensbrück had facilities for the production of munitions and weapon components. Some prisoners were forced to work assembling parts for V-2 rockets or in mechanical workshops that supplied the Wehrmacht. These tasks were extremely dangerous, as any mistake could cause serious accidents, burns, or amputations. The constant pressure to meet high production quotas increased tension and stress, leading to physical and mental exhaustion. Another area of exploitation was the construction and maintenance of the camp itself and its subcamps. The prisoners carried out masonry work, forest clearing, land drainage, and the transport of heavy materials. Even the youngest, sick or injured, were forced to participate. Every movement was supervised by armed guards and captors who punished any delay, stumble, or attempt at resistance. Beatings and physical punishments were common, and collective punishment was used to sow fear and consolidate obedience. Forced labor in Ravensbrück was not limited to production or construction. It also included the most intimate and degrading exploitation. Many prisoners were forced into domestic tasks for the SS, cleaning residences, kitchens, laundries, and providing personal services. To this was added daily humiliation, constant surveillance, and the obligation to appear impeccable in appearance, even though their bodies were exhausted and ill. The objective of labor was not only economic. The Nazis also sought the transformation of the prisoners into docile and submissive subjects. Physical exploitation was combined with psychological control. Endless workdays, constant hunger, and sleep deprivation weakened resistance and fostered absolute dependence on the captors. Hunger, systematically applied through minimal rations and food insufficient for the physical wear of labor, was an instrument of control as much as a consequence of genocidal policy. As the war advanced, the demand for labor increased, and the camp became an essential cog in the German war economy. Companies such as Siemens, AEG, and others linked to the war effort began to send orders and request labor, which expanded the intensity of forced labor and prolonged the workdays. Even sick or weakened by malnutrition and disease, they were taken to the factories under threat of punishment or death. The exploitation in Ravensbrück reflects a central principle of the Nazi system. Human life could be completely subordinated to the objectives of the state. Each prisoner was a resource, an instrument to sustain the war, supply industry, and perpetuate a regime based on fear, discipline, and ideological supremacy. The brutality of forced labor not only destroyed bodies, but also served as a mechanism of humiliation and dehumanization, reinforcing the idea that the prisoners were considered inferior and expendable. Ravensbrück became, over time, one of the most notorious centers of the Third Reich for inhuman medical experimentation. From its beginnings, the camp had been designed to control, punish, and exploit the female prisoners, but as the war advanced, its function expanded to include medical and surgical tests that disregarded the life and dignity of the inmates. The experiments began mainly from 1942, when the medical staff of the SS saw in the prisoners an available group for tests that, under normal circumstances, would have been impossible to carry out. These tests were justified under the pretext of scientific research, but in reality they were cruel trials that sought to advance military medicine, test medications, surgeries, and sterilization techniques without anesthesia, and study the limits of the human body under extreme conditions. Among the best-known experiments were those related to infections and diseases. Prisoners were deliberately infected with typhus, malaria, tuberculosis, or other pathologies, with the aim of studying the progression of the disease and the effectiveness of certain treatments. Many women died in the process, and those who survived were left with permanent after-effects, mutilations, or irreversible damage. Another field of experimentation was that of forced sterilization. Nazi doctors sought rapid and effective methods to prevent the reproduction of women they considered unfit according to the racial ideology of the Reich. Radiations, surgical interventions without anesthesia, and devastating chemicals were used, all with the intention of turning these women into subjects who could be observed without the possibility of transmitting offspring. This type of test had a double objective: scientific and political, since it reinforced the eugenic policy of the regime and the control of the population according to racial criteria. The orthopedic and surgical experiments were equally brutal. Prisoners were subjected to cuts, partial amputations, grafts, and induced fractures, often without anesthesia or adequate post-operative care. These procedures were used to simulate war wounds or to study tissue regeneration. Each intervention was coldly recorded, as if the bodies were mere study objects and not human beings suffering extreme pain. In addition, experiments were carried out related to physical endurance and adaptation to extreme conditions. Prisoners were exposed to drastic changes in temperature, forced to walk until exhaustion, or subjected to deliberate starvation to study the effects on the human body. The results were meticulously documented, but ethics were completely absent. The lives of the women were irrelevant to the perpetrators. The medical personnel who carried out these practices were composed mainly of SS members and prestigious doctors within the Nazi system, many of whom defended their actions as contributions to the welfare of the state and to scientific progress. The camp bureaucracy facilitated these crimes, recording each test with cold and detailed reports, without considering that behind each piece of data there was a person suffering. In Ravensbrück, the violation of human rights was absolute and systematic. The prisoners were not only exploited as labor or punished for resisting, but their bodies became human laboratories. Privacy, dignity, and autonomy were completely eliminated. Each woman was at the mercy of the doctors and the camp authorities. These actions were part of a larger pattern, the normalization of suffering and the objectification of human beings as an integral part of the functioning of the Third Reich. The medical experiments in Ravensbrück did not end with the liberation of the camp. They left deep marks on the survivors, many of whom suffered physical and psychological damage for the rest of their lives. The historical memory of the camp recalls not only repression and forced labor, but also the atrocity of these trials, which are a testimony to the extreme to which a regime can go when science is completely subordinated to ideology and power. Daily life in Ravensbrück was designed to break the prisoners physically and psychologically from the first moment. Nothing in that space was intended for comfort or survival. Everything was subordinated to extreme discipline, forced labor, and absolute control by the SS. From dawn, the prisoners were awakened with shouts and bugle calls, forced to rise quickly and line up in endless rows for morning roll calls. These roll calls not only served to count the inmates, but also to instill fear and demonstrate the omnipresence of Nazi power. A delay or a wrong movement could mean severe physical punishment or even death. Labor was the axis of the daily routine. Many prisoners were assigned to industrial workshops inside the camp where they had to produce uniforms, munitions, weapon components, or perform maintenance tasks. Others were sent to external labor camps in factories or facilities under SS control, where the workday could exceed 12 or 14 hours in extreme conditions of cold, heat, or humidity. The food was scarce and of poor quality, deliberately designed to weaken the prisoners and increase their vulnerability. Hard bread, watery soups, and small portions of margarine or potatoes were the usual menu. Malnutrition and disease spread rapidly, exacerbated by the lack of hygiene and overcrowding in the barracks. The barracks, built of wood, housed dozens of women in reduced space. The beds were simple bunks with minimal blankets, and there was no privacy whatsoever. Intimacy was an inexistent concept. Even the most basic moments of hygiene were regulated and watched. Sexual abuse and violence by the guards were frequent, although many times silenced by fear and the complicity of the system. In addition to labor and discipline, life in Ravensbrück was marked by systematic humiliation. Prisoners were forced to wear identical uniforms with a triangle of fabric indicating the category for which they had been arrested: communists, Jewish women, Roma women, religious women, asocials, or criminals. This visual coding served to reinforce the hierarchy within the camp and to facilitate dehumanization. Each category implied a different treatment. Some prisoners were assigned to harder labor, others to cleaning tasks, or to being subjects of medical experiments. The medical aspect of the camp also formed part of the routine. From its creation, Ravensbrück was a place where unethical medical practices were applied. Prisoners were selected to experiment with new medications, forced sterilizations, and surgical procedures that caused extreme pain, mutilations, or even death. The experiments were carried out with bureaucratic precision, as if the lives of the women were mere data on a spreadsheet. Social control in the camp was absolute. Distrust among prisoners was encouraged by the SS. Denunciations, collective punishments, and public humiliations ensured that no one broke discipline or tried to subvert the imposed order. Physical and psychological violence was constant, and hopelessness became a permanent companion. Despite this, small acts of resistance emerged. Some prisoners shared information, food, or moral support, always at the risk of immediate reprisals. Ravensbrück, more than a concentration camp, was a microcosm of totalitarian terror where every minute was regulated by Nazi ideology. Daily life was marked by the struggle to survive, systematic exploitation, and constant humiliation, while the regime used the prisoners as cogs in its war machine and as subjects of experimentation. Each day represented an extreme challenge where physical and psychological endurance was continually tested and where the humanity of those who remained there was attacked in a meticulous and deliberate manner. Ravensbrück was not simply another concentration camp within the vast repressive system of the Third Reich. It played a strategic and multifaceted role that made it an essential cog within the Nazi machinery. Its importance was not limited to being a place of imprisonment or punishment. It represented an instrument of social, political, and racial control, in addition to functioning as an economic and scientific tool in the service of the regime. From its creation, the Nazi authorities designed Ravensbrück with clear objectives: to keep under surveillance women considered dangerous or undesirable, to discipline them according to the values of National Socialism, and to extract from them some benefit, whether through forced labor, propaganda, or medical experimentation. Within the Nazi system, Ravensbrück served as a concentration center specialized in women, complementing other camps that mainly received men. This differentiation allowed the SS to organize repression in a more systematic way. Men were destined for forced labor or extermination camps in the East, while women, in addition to being subjected to heavy labor, were the object of medical experiments and ideological indoctrination programs in line with Hitler's vision of the Aryan woman as mother and caretaker of the race. The camp was also a social laboratory in which new forms of control and discipline were applied, from strict supervision of daily activities to the imposition of exemplary punishments for any form of disobedience. Violence, humiliation, and segregation were not incidental but deliberate mechanisms to demonstrate the supremacy of the state over individual life. Ravensbrück also fulfilled an economic role. The German war industry, together with the SS, exploited the female labor force of the camp in factories, workshops, and construction projects. This made the prisoners essential parts within the industrial production of the Reich, although always under inhuman conditions that weakened their health and reduced their life expectancy. The connection between forced labor and the structure of the camp reflected the logic of the Nazi system. Each prisoner had to generate usefulness, whether physical or symbolic, reinforcing the idea that human life was subordinate to the state. In ideological and propagandistic terms, Ravensbrück was also key for the regime. Its existence sent a message of absolute power. Any woman who challenged authority, opposed the party, or did not fit into the imposed racial model could be isolated, punished, and dehumanized. The reports about the prisoners, the punishments applied, and the experiments carried out were used internally to reinforce discipline among the SS ranks and to justify before the Nazi hierarchy the continuation of these repressive policies. The camp functioned in this way as an instrument of terror and obedience, ensuring that the threat perceived by the regime, even in women, was controlled in a systematic and exemplary manner. Likewise, Ravensbrück was integrated into a network of subcamps and satellite camps that extended throughout Germany and the occupied territories, which increased its reach and effectiveness within the Nazi system. This network allowed for the efficient mobilization of human and material resources, distributing the female labor force across different industries and military projects, and consolidating the function of the camps as interconnected elements of repression and exploitation. The coordination between Ravensbrück, other female facilities, and the male extermination camps reinforced the idea that the regime did not view human lives as individuals, but as parts of a hierarchical mechanism in the service of its racial, economic, and military objectives. Taken together, the role of Ravensbrück within the Nazi system was multiple and complex. It was not only a place of imprisonment, but a center of discipline, exploitation, experimentation, and ideological control. It represented the extension of the absolute power of the Reich over the lives of women, consolidating the policy of terror that defined Nazi Germany and ensuring that its ideological principles were translated into concrete acts upon millions of people. The existence of Ravensbrück underscores the way in which the regime turned systematic repression into a central instrument of its power, demonstrating that oppression, exploitation, and death could be organized with precision, planning, and administrative efficiency, within a system that aimed to dominate all aspects of human life under Nazi ideology. Experiences in Ravensbrück, the women's concentration camp. It was the silence before the scream. A thick fog covered the forests of northern Germany when, in 1939, the first trucks arrived at a small village called Ravensbrück. No one could imagine that over the years that name would become synonymous with horror, suffering, and cruelty. On the shores of Lake Schwedt, amid a landscape that seemed a natural paradise, the Nazis built the hell destined exclusively for women, the Ravensbrück concentration camp. Welcome to one of the darkest and least known pages of human history. When we speak of the Nazi concentration camps, the first names that usually come to mind are Auschwitz, Dachau, or Treblinka. However, few remember Ravensbrück, and perhaps that makes it even more terrifying. It was the only main camp of the Third Reich built with a specific purpose: to imprison, exploit, and annihilate women. More than 130,000 prisoners were deported there. Thousands never survived to tell what they lived through behind those walls. From its first months of operation, Ravensbrück showed its true essence. The prisoners arrived in overcrowded trains, chained, weakened by hunger and uncertainty. Upon crossing the Iron Gate, they lost their name, their history, and their dignity. They were reduced to a number, to a ragged uniform, and to a routine marked by terror. The Nazi regime justified its existence by claiming that it was a re-education center for women considered undesirable for Aryan society. But the reality was much more sinister. Ravensbrück became a space of systematic torture, forced labor, medical experiments, and slow extermination. There were imprisoned Jewish women, Roma women, communists, political opponents, Jehovah's Witnesses, prostitutes, lesbians, and women with disabilities. All of them were seen as disposable, as expendable pieces in the mechanism of a system that sought to crush any form of difference or resistance. The camp was directed mainly by women members of the SS. One of the most feared figures was the supervisor Dorothea Binns, whose coldness and relentlessness made her a symbol of institutionalized sadism. Under her command and that of other guards, a brutal surveillance apparatus was formed where any act of disobedience, real or imagined, could be punished with beatings, prolonged confinement, or even public executions. One of the most cruel aspects of Ravensbrück was slave labor. The prisoners were forced to work endless days in inhuman conditions, producing uniforms for the army, performing heavy construction tasks, or serving as free labor for companies linked to the regime. This forced labor was not simply exploitation. It was a calculated mechanism to break bodies and wills, a slow process of physical and psychological annihilation. The inmates were forced to sew uniforms for the German army, manufacture munitions, or perform forced labor under inhuman conditions in factories that belonged to large companies complicit with the Nazi regime. Their daily life was marked by exploitation and misery. They slept crowded in unsanitary barracks, received minimal food rations that barely allowed them to survive, and lived under the constant fear of being selected for exemplary punishments for medical experiments or, in the worst case, for being sent to the gas chamber. Because yes, Ravensbrück had its own gas chamber. As the war advanced and the number of prisoners increased, the Nazis installed a crematorium and later a portable gas chamber inside the camp. With that, the logic of extermination intensified. What had at first been conceived as a center of repression and slave labor ended up becoming an authentic machine of systematic death. However, the most chilling aspect was not only the quick deaths, but the prolonged suffering. One of the most inhuman chapters of Ravensbrück was the medical experiments carried out on young women, mostly Polish, disparagingly known as the guinea pigs. They were subjected to cruel operations where their wounds were deliberately infected, healthy limbs amputated, or drugs and chemical compounds tested without anesthesia. Many died in unbearable pain, others survived but were left with indelible physical and psychological scars. These experiments had no other purpose than to test the limits of the human body and the effectiveness of supposed medical treatments, always in service of Nazi ideology and without the slightest trace of ethics or consent. Meanwhile, outside, life seemed to continue normally. The neighboring villages suspected what was happening behind the walls, but fear, indifference, or ideological complicity kept most in silence. The smoke from the crematorium filled the air. The screams of the prisoners sometimes reached the road, and yet the veil of silence remained intact. Despite everything, the women of Ravensbrück found ways to resist. In secret, they shared pieces of bread, whispered poems or songs in their native languages, and supported each other in the darkest moments. Mothers tried to protect their daughters. Comrades cared for the sick. Gestures of solidarity became a silent resistance against a system that sought to strip them of all humanity. In the midst of pain and despair, sparks of compassion arose that defied the logic of the executioners. That sisterhood among women was not only a form of comfort, but also an act of rebellion against horror, the proof that even in the heart of hell, human dignity could continue to shine. The story of Ravensbrück is also a story of oblivion. For decades, this concentration camp remained in the shadow of more well-known names such as Auschwitz or Dachau. However, the women who survived Ravensbrück carried with them scars impossible to erase, both physical and emotional. Some testified at the Nuremberg trials, others wrote books or letters, but all lived with the weight of having witnessed the worst of the human condition. As the war reached its climax and the Allied forces approached, the situation inside Ravensbrück became even more desperate. Executions accelerated, conditions deteriorated brutally, and the camp descended into chaos driven by the panic of the Nazis themselves. Instead of stopping the crimes, they intensified them. The last weeks were not an ending but an accelerated nightmare, the monstrous collapse of a system that, even in its agony, remained obsessed with killing. When the Soviet troops began advancing from the east and news spread of the liberation of other camps, the Nazi regime responded with a mixture of desperation and redoubled cruelty. The prisoners sensed that something was approaching. The sounds of bombings came from the distance, and the SS guards, aware of the imminent defeat, acted with greater brutality, as if they wanted to erase all evidence of their crimes before the arrival of the Allies. It was then that the death marches began. Endless columns of skeletal women were forced to walk kilometers in the cold, dressed in rags, without food or water. There was no real destination. The only purpose was to move them away from the Soviet advance. Many prisoners collapsed along the way and were executed on the spot or simply abandoned to die. Inside the camp, those too weak to march were left behind. Thousands died of starvation, others disappeared without a trace. In those final days, the gas chambers and crematorium operated without rest. The goal was to exterminate as many prisoners as possible before the arrival of the Soviet soldiers. What happened in Ravensbrück in its last days was the extreme reflection of Nazi logic, a system capable of dragging its cruelty to the last second of its existence, even when its defeat was already inevitable. The crematory ovens worked without rest. The Nazis, aware that the end was near, burned documents, destroyed files, and tried to erase all evidence of their crimes. But the smell of death already permeated every corner of the camp. On the 30th of April of 1945, the Soviet troops reached Ravensbrück. What they found was a scene of indescribable horror. More than 3,000 dying women, bodies piled up in corridors and courtyards, rooms infested with rats, and a stench of blood and decomposition that seemed to scream for justice. Many of the survivors were in a state of shock, unable to speak or even stand. Hell had ended, but the pain was just beginning. The liberation of Ravensbrück did not represent a happy ending, but the beginning of another battle. The struggle to tell what had happened, to demand justice, and to recover a voice that had been taken from them for years. Unlike other concentration camps, Ravensbrück did not immediately receive the same media attention nor the same place in historical memory. The fact that the victims were, for the most part, women contributed to the delay in recognizing the story with the relevance it deserved. Nevertheless, thanks to the survivors, the truth came to light. In 1947, during the so-called Ravensbrück trials held in Hamburg, several of those responsible were finally brought to justice. 16 women, along with Nazi doctors, were accused of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Among them was Dorothea Binz, the infamous supervisor of the camp, whose cold face and total absence of remorse became symbols of the banality of evil. She was sentenced to death and executed by hanging. However, many other accomplices never faced consequences. The weight of the accusation rested on the testimonies of the survivors. Voices such as those of Olga Lengyel, Wanda Potowska, or Margarete Buber-Neumann were fundamental in reconstructing the truth. They recounted the methods of torture, chronic hunger, medical experiments, and constant fear. But they also spoke of something the Nazis could never destroy: silent resistance, the tenderness that emerged amid horror, the ability to remain human when everything sought to reduce them to numbers, objects, or silence. One of the most powerful elements of those testimonies was the sisterhood that was born among the prisoners. In Ravensbrück, solidarity was not only a value, it was a tool of survival. The women shared the little they had: a piece of bread, a button, a song whispered in their language. They helped each other stay standing during inspections. They hid the weakest to prevent them from being selected for medical experiments. They found ways to preserve sanity and dignity amid hell. In the darkness, the light was the face of another woman willing to hold you up. After the war, the fate of the camp added another layer of silence. The land of Ravensbrück was used for years by the Soviet army, which delayed the creation of an official memorial. It was not until much later that the world began to fully recognize the magnitude of what happened there. Today, Ravensbrück is remembered not only as a symbol of Nazi horror, but also as a testimony of female resistance in the face of barbarism. An uncomfortable, painful memory, but essential to understanding history and ensuring that such atrocities are never repeated. It was not until the decade of 1980 that Ravensbrück began to be recovered as an authentic site of memory. For years, the place remained silent, used for military purposes and detached from the remembrance of the thousands of victims who suffered there. Today, in the very space where indescribable atrocities were committed, a museum and a memorial monument stand to honor all the women who passed through that hell. However, memory does not live solely in stone or marble. It lives in words, in transmitted stories, in the conscious decision not to forget. Speaking of Ravensbrück today is, above all, an act of justice. In a world where discourses of hatred, intolerance, and misogyny reappear under new masks, remembering what happened there is not an exercise of the past, but a form of active resistance. It is a warning for the present and the future because history, when not faced with truth, has the terrible habit of repeating itself. The survivors carried scars that never closed. Some, unable to relive the pain, kept silent until the end of their days. Others, on the contrary, turned their experience into a mission. They founded memory associations, participated in annual meetings, wrote books, gave lectures, collaborated in films and documentary archives. Each testimony, each word was an effort to keep the truth alive against oblivion. And even so, for millions of people, the name Ravensbrück remains unknown. It is precisely for this reason that its story must occupy the place it deserves in universal history. Ravensbrück is not only a symbol of Nazi horror, it is also a reminder of the destructive power that hatred can reach when it becomes state policy. It was a camp where women were chosen as targets, not only because of their religion, ideology, or ethnic origin, but also for the simple fact of being women within a system that sought to eliminate everything that did not fit its ideal of perfection. And yet, in the midst of barbarism, Ravensbrück also left the testimony of something profoundly human, that even in the worst of hells, dignity can survive, that solidarity and sisterhood can become acts of resistance, that voices can rise even among ashes and barbed wire. Remembering Ravensbrück is not only looking backward, it is walking forward with open eyes, with the awareness that only memory can shield us against the repetition of such horrors. The history of Ravensbrück is not yet completely told. Each recovered testimony, each document found, each name rescued from oblivion expands the dimension of what that place meant. And in that process of memory, it is not only about commemorating the victims, but also about learning from them, from their resistance, their humanity, their ability to support one another when everything was designed to destroy them. Among the thousands of stories that emerge from Ravensbrück, some stand out for the moral strength they convey. They are personal testimonies that, despite the pain, manage to give a human face to the overwhelming numbers. One of those voices was that of Germaine Tillion, a French ethnologist and member of the resistance arrested in 1942 and sent to the camp. From within Ravensbrück, risking her life with every gesture, she began to secretly document the atrocities she witnessed. Her objective was clear, that one day the world would know what happened there. Tillion wrote, hid, and preserved her notes, which later became one of the most detailed and valuable testimonies about life inside the camp. In her writings, she speaks of the hunger that reduced the women to shadows of themselves, of the cold that bit into their bones during endless nights, and of the exhausting labor that turned each day into a challenge for survival. But she also recounted how even amid that hell, the prisoners found ways of resistance: clandestine language classes, small educational talks, or improvised theatrical performances that, although brief, gave them back for a moment the humanity that the Nazi system tried to take from them. In another corner of the camp, the story of Wanda Potawska, a young Polish medical student, reflects another face of horror. She was one of the victims of the infamous medical experiments conducted by Nazi doctors, among them Karl Gebhardt. Prisoners were subjected to forced surgical operations. Their legs were opened, objects inserted, tissues infected with bacteria, all without anesthesia. The objective was to create artificial wounds to experiment with possible treatments. The result was devastating: widespread infections, unbearable pain, deaths from sepsis, and irreversible consequences. Wanda, against all odds, survived. After the war, she became a doctor and human rights activist, carrying with her the memory of her companions who did not manage to come out alive. Her testimony was an act of denunciation and, at the same time, of resistance against oblivion. The experiences of women such as Germaine Tillion and Wanda Potawska clearly show that the horrors experienced in Ravensbrück were not accidents or isolated excesses of some individuals. They were part of a systematic policy precisely designed to punish, break, and eliminate, applying violence and humiliation as instruments of absolute power. In the internal documents of the SS, Ravensbrück appeared described as a model of efficiency. The Nazis reduced the prisoners to simple numbers, to human material that could be used, exploited, and discarded. Each transport, each death, each medical experiment was recorded with bureaucratic coldness that turned human tragedy into an administrative report. The machinery of genocide operated with relentless logic, devoid of compassion. However, against that logic of death arose gestures of life. The prisoners wove clandestine networks to hide medicines, alleviate the pain of the sick, or care for the youngest. Amid an environment designed to sow mistrust and fear, solidarity and mutual support emerged. Despite barriers of language, nationality, or religion, many managed to communicate through a knowing look, a brief whisper, or a touch at the right moment. Humanity did not disappear in Ravensbrück. It took refuge in the smallest gestures, in those small acts of resistance that kept alive the spark of dignity. One of the most heartbreaking episodes was that of the mothers and their children. Ravensbrück was not conceived to house children, and yet on occasion, some pregnant women gave birth in the barracks under inhuman conditions. The babies rarely survived more than a few weeks. Malnutrition, lack of hygiene, and extreme cold quickly took their lives. The mothers, devastated, held their dying children without being able to do anything to save them. For many of them, the worst punishment was not hunger, cold, or forced labor, but the impotence of not being able to protect what was most precious to them. In the final stages of the war, when the Nazi collapse was imminent, the conditions inside the camp deteriorated dramatically. Deportations to other, even more lethal camps, such as Auschwitz or Bergen-Belsen, intensified, while in Ravensbrück summary executions and forced marches increased. Thousands of women were forced to walk long distances until they collapsed on the road, shot in ditches, or buried in mass graves in the middle of the forests. The official statistics failed to capture the real magnitude of the horror. Behind each number there was an interrupted life, a destroyed family, a future torn out by the roots. Ravensbrück was not only a cog within the machinery of Nazism, but also a symbol of how far cruelty can go when combined with ideological fanaticism and systematic dehumanization. After the liberation, the world took a long time to hear what had really happened in Ravensbrück. The reconstruction of Europe focused on the political and economic aspects, while the voices of the surviving women were relegated to the background. They not only had to fight against the memories of the violence they had suffered, but also against the silence and forgetfulness of a society that did not want to look back. For many, speaking of Ravensbrück meant reopening wounds that never healed. However, some decided to tell what they had lived through, and thanks to their courage, we now know the details. One of those voices was that of Margarete Buber-Neumann, who wrote extensively about her years of captivity. She had suffered first under Stalin's regime and later under Nazism, becoming a living testimony of how totalitarianisms could devastate a single person's life through different ideologies, but with the same logic of oppression. Her account is a demonstration that the body can be subdued, humiliated, and beaten, but critical thought and dignity are much harder to destroy. The archives of Ravensbrück, partially recovered after the war, reveal shocking figures. It is estimated that more than 20,000 women died there, many of them without ever being officially registered. Among the victims, there were also around 1,000 girls and adolescents, some barely 12 years old. Others were elderly women, arrested for helping Jews, for political activities, or even for refusing to swear loyalty to the Nazi regime. In Ravensbrück, there was no limit to cruelty. The only criterion was the absolute and dehumanizing power that the system exercised over female bodies. In the following years, many of the former SS guards tried to justify themselves. They claimed they were only following orders, that they did not fully understand what was happening in the camp, or that they feared reprisals if they disobeyed. But the testimonies of the survivors, the photographs, and the documents prove the opposite. The guards of Ravensbrück were not mere spectators. They actively participated in the punishments, in the tortures, and in the executions. They were executioners with uniform and whip, an essential part of the machinery of death. Today, walking through the remains of Ravensbrück is an experience that freezes the soul. The semi-ruined barracks, the silent walls, the crematorium, the watchtowers that still rise against the sky. Each structure seems to speak. Every corner remembers the thousands of women who passed through there and the voices that for too long were silenced. The silence that envelops Ravensbrück is not peace, it is memory. In every corner, in every stone, still resonate the echoes of voices that never should have been silenced. And yet Ravensbrück is not only a story of horror. It is also a story of courage, of resilience, of women who, at the limits of existence, decided not to surrender, who fought to preserve their identity, their dignity, and their faith in a better world. Women who survived to tell what they saw, and who today offer us that legacy as a warning, as testimony, and as an urgent call to never repeat those crimes. The story, however, does not end with liberation. It still remains to speak of the legacy of these women, of the impact of their words, and of how Ravensbrück over time became an eternal symbol of what it means to resist evil with the sole strength of the human spirit. After the post-war trials, the world slowly began to grasp the magnitude of the crimes committed there. But official recognition was not immediate. Amid the reconstruction of Europe and with the Cold War underway, the memories of the prisoners were scattered among forgotten archives, hidden personal diaries, and barely read testimonies. Once again, female voices were marginalized in a history that preferred to narrate battles, generals, and treaties rather than listen to the suffering of thousands of women. Nevertheless, many survivors refused silence. They turned pain into a mission of life. They traveled to schools, universities, parliaments, and international forums. They told their stories not driven by hatred, but by a moral duty, not in search of revenge, but in the name of memory. Because what happened in Ravensbrück had to be known, understood, and felt. It was not enough to repeat that it was a women's camp. It was necessary to understand what that meant. The Nazi regime had carried out the systematic destruction of the life, body, and spirit of tens of thousands of innocent women chosen as targets not only for their religion or ideology, but also for the simple fact of being women in a system that wanted to annihilate everything that did not fit its vision of perfection. For decades, in eastern Germany, the land of Ravensbrück was used as a Soviet military base. That delayed the possibility of turning it into a place of memory. It was not until the late 1980s that the recovery of the site began, precisely at a moment when Europe was also on the threshold of a historic change. Today, the Ravensbrück Memorial stands as a place of reflection and awareness. It is not only a museum or a monument, it is a living reminder of what barbarism means when hatred and indifference prevail, and of what it means to resist even in the worst of hells. On its walls, in its barracks, in its ruins, dwells a message that transcends time. Remembering is not an act of nostalgia, it is an act of resistance. Today in Ravensbrück, some of the original barracks, the entrance wall, the crematorium, and the remains of the SS headquarters are still preserved. Each structure speaks with the weight of memory. Monuments and commemorative plaques honor the victims, and each year international delegations, families of survivors, and activists travel there to pay tribute. They do so in silence, leaving flowers, letters, and tears in an intimate and collective gesture that keeps alive the memory of those who passed through that hell. In recent years, one of the most powerful initiatives has been the creation of exhibitions that rescue names, faces, and personal belongings of the prisoners. What for decades was anonymity, number, and silence has slowly been transformed into individual history. A black and white photograph of a young Polish woman, the hidden notebook of a French student who wrote poems and reflections, the scarf knitted by a Norwegian mother on cold nights to warm her daughter. Each piece is a fragment of recovered dignity, a material testimony that restores humanity to those whom the Nazis tried to reduce to numbers. Over time, Ravensbrück has also become a feminist symbol of resistance. In a world where women continue to face violence, discrimination, and inequality, the story of these prisoners resounds as a warning and as inspiration. They were persecuted for what they represented, for being Jewish, Roma, communist, lesbian, political opponents, for defying imposed norms, or simply for being women in a patriarchal and totalitarian system that considered them disposable. Their suffering, but also their strength and solidarity, still challenge us today. The lessons that emerge from Ravensbrück are universal. They speak to us of the danger of dehumanization, of how evil can be institutionalized and become routine, of what happens when a society allows a few to decide who deserves to live and who must die. They remind us that hatred does not arise from nothing. It is built slowly, fed by discourses of intolerance, by laws that exclude, by glances that normalize, by the indifference of those who prefer not to see. That is why Ravensbrück is not only a dark page of history, it is also a mirror and a warning. It teaches us that only a vigilant, conscious, and empathetic citizenry can prevent something similar from happening again. And at the same time, it reminds us that even in the worst of hells, human dignity can flourish, that solidarity can be an act of resistance, and that memory is, in itself, a form of justice. It also reminds us that solidarity can bloom even in the most brutal conditions. In Ravensbrück, one woman could support another with a simple look. A minimal gesture could save a life. A piece of shared bread could mean hope. Humanity is not erased by uniforms or barbed wire. That camp was not only a place of death, it was also a space where a sisterhood was born, forged in pain and in hope, a sorority that defied the logic of hatred. Today, when anti-Semitism, racism and misogyny resurface in different corners of the world, remembering Ravensbrück is more urgent than ever. Not as a museum of past horrors, but as a living warning, as an echo that crosses generations. Each era, each society, has the responsibility to listen to the voices of the past and act in the present, to educate, to speak, to resist. This video does not seek simply to move, it seeks to mobilize, that we may not remain as passive spectators of history, but that we may learn to look around us with eyes wide open, to recognize the signs of hatred before it is too late. That we honor the memory of the women of Ravensbrück not with silence but with action. And to you who have come this far, we ask something more. Share this testimony. Speak of Ravensbrück with your friends, with your family, with your children. Because as long as we keep naming them, they remain alive. Because oblivion is the second murder. And you, with your memory and with your word, can be part of the resistance in a world that often prefers to forget. Remembering is a radical act. May no woman ever again be reduced to a number. May no system ever again have the power to destroy without consequences. May Ravensbrück remain in our memory, not as a shadow that paralyzes, but as a beacon that illuminates the path toward a more just and humane future. And thus, after walking through the walls, the forests, and the testimonies of Ravensbrück, we understand that this was not just another concentration camp, but a place where human suffering reached unimaginable dimensions. The experiences of those who survived remind us of the strength of resistance, the importance of memory, and the necessity of never forgetting. Because remembering Ravensbrück is not only to reconstruct history, it is to assume our responsibility to prevent horror from repeating itself. What happened there continues to resonate today, and its lessons remain more relevant than ever.